Hey there, curious minds. Ever wonder what truly happens behind the scenes when nuclear-armed nations face off? It's often far more complex than the simple bilateral chess match we might imagine. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a fascinating concept that really reshapes our understanding of peace and war in the nuclear age. Brokered bargaining.
Yeah.
We're sifting through some incredible material, really an in-depth exploration of how third parties, often kind of operating out of the spotlight, quietly shape outcomes in the most dangerous conflicts. And this isn't just theory. We're going to unpack real-world cases, mainly from South Asia, and then zoom out a bit to see how these dynamics play out globally. Our mission today is, well, to give you a shortcut to being well-informed on a topic that's frankly more relevant than ever. You'll walk away with surprising facts and a clearer picture of this intricate dance between nuclear rivals and the powerful outsiders who step in. To help us navigate this intricate landscape, we have a truly insightful guide joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. You know, what's truly fascinating is seeing how much our understanding of nuclear crises has evolved. It's really gone beyond the traditional Cold War framework, revealing a much more nuanced kind of three-dimensional game at play.
That's a powerful shift in understanding. So can you explain how that three-dimensional game changes the fundamental calculus for these nations? And how does it lead us to, well, the heart of how peace is brokered in these nuclear environments?
Absolutely. To really grasp this idea of brokered bargaining, we first need to understand how nuclear crises themselves have fundamentally changed since the Cold War.
Okay, so what defined those early days? And how is today fundamentally different?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the Cold War was primarily a bilateral affair. You had the two superpowers, right? The U.S. and the Soviet Union locked in this intense rivalry. Their dynamic was driven by a careful balance of signaling resolve, showing strength, but also exercising extreme caution. Concepts like brinkmanship, pushing conflicts right to the edge to gain an advantage, they were tested. And out of that tense experience, they developed direct communication protocols, arms control agreements, often born from let's say, a deeply held common understanding that any nuclear use was just profoundly undesirable.
Right, so even when allies were involved, it was largely a two-actor model.
Yeah.
Because the superpowers pretty much call the shots for their clients.
Precisely. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. That era then gave way to the post-Cold War period. And this introduced regional nuclear states operating in what people call a unipolar world, with the United States as the dominant global power. This changes everything. It shifts from a two-actor scenario to a three-way interaction, which is, well, the very essence of brokered bargaining.
Okay, now that makes sense. So with this foundation, let's explore how the third party actually wields its influence during these crises. They're not just observers, are they?
No, definitely not. And that's a crucial consideration. What is the third party's actual role? They're not passive observers at all. Instead, they actively manage the crisis. They act essentially as a power mediator, or sometimes even a manipulator. They seek to de-escalate by combining their own acute sensitivity to the risks of escalation with the regional rival's sensitivity to the third party's preferences. Because, let's face it, that third party often has the power to decisively influence the outcome. This involves leveraging influence through inducements, think aid, or diplomatic support and sanctions like economic penalties or international isolation. And this can happen even if they aren't seen as entirely impartial. They might strategically manage information flow or even sometimes exaggerate or misrepresent risks just to push the parties towards backing down.
And you mentioned earlier some unique challenges for these newer regional nuclear powers compared to the old Cold War superpowers. That makes this third-party role even more vital, doesn't it?
Absolutely, it does. These regional states often lack the extensive experience in nuclear management that the superpowers built up over decades. They usually possess smaller arsenals, which might be more vulnerable, and they have fewer resources for robust safety protocols. Geographically, they're often right next to each other, contiguous borders, which dramatically reduces decision and reaction times in a crisis. It's much faster. Add to that unsettled borders, long-standing rivalries, often with significant religious or ideological overtones, and sometimes domestic instability. Well, you see why the third party's role becomes so critical. And the fear of loose nukes, nuclear weapons falling into the wrong hands, that also looms much larger in these contexts.
Okay, let's ground this theory now. Our sources really hone in on the India-Pakistan dynamic, exploring three major crises in just a decade. Let's start with the Kargil conflict in 1999.
Right, Kargil. That crisis emerged literally right after India and Pakistan had conducted their nuclear tests. It followed a brief and actually unprecedented period of peace dialogue, including something called the Lahore Declaration. Pakistan initiated an incursion into Indian-controlled territory, but their strategy really relied on plausible deniability, trying to deny direct state involvement and risk manipulation. They aimed to portray India's inevitable response as aggression, hoping to draw international attention and, crucially, intervention.
And India's response, that was quite revealing, wasn't it? They consciously avoided escalating. They didn't cross the line of control of the de facto border, even though militarily it might have made sense. How did that strategic restraint, which seems almost counterintuitive militarily, play into this larger game of brokered bargaining?
That's a really crucial insight. India chose strategic restraint very deliberately. The idea was to keep the moral high ground internationally and gain political gains with the world community. They even, according to the analysis, absorbed additional casualties to secure that third-party support. This really highlights their acute concern for the third-party signals and preferences, even though India has this sort of ingrained distrust of third-party involvement in their bilateral issues. So this surprising restraint, it truly underscores the power of that external influence.
Okay, and what about the U.S. response during Kargil? How did the U.S. navigate this really complex situation?
Well, the U.S., as the primary third party, stepped in quickly. They started by issuing demarches, which are formal diplomatic protests, and they blamed Pakistan, first in private and then in public. President Clinton directly threatened Pakistan's leader at the time, Nawaz Sharif, with international isolation. He demanded a withdrawal, even blocking UN mediation efforts. But here's the key part. Clinton also offered Sharif a face-saver, a promise of his personal interest in getting dialogue restarted. This allowed Pakistan to back down politically without losing all credibility at home. And interestingly, China, usually a close ally of Pakistan, stayed neutral. They privately asked Pakistan to de-escalate, which many analysts think was a key factor in Pakistan's eventual withdrawal.
Wow, that's a remarkable balancing act by the U.S. What were the specific factors that allowed them to successfully combine, blame with a face-saving exit in Kargil?
I think it was a combination of clear, firm demands coupled with that diplomatic off-ramp. The U.S. understood that Pakistan needed a way to save face internally, politically, while still complying with the international demand to withdraw. Offering that personal interest in future dialogue gave Sharif the political cover he needed. It made de-escalation possible.
Right. Now let's fast forward a bit to the 2001-2002 military standoff, often called Twin Peaks. This crisis had a different feel to it, didn't it?
Indeed. Very different. This was triggered by a devastating terrorist attack on the Indian parliament, and later another attack, the Kluchak attack. India then adopted a limited war under the nuclear umbrella doctrine, basically a strategy for conventional warfare in a nuclearized environment. They felt their conventional military superiority was being neutralized by what they saw as Pakistan's nuclear blackmail, Pakistan deterring India's conventional options by hinting at nuclear escalation.
India even mobilized extensively, signaled military action.
Uh-huh.
But it seems they were also, again, very attuned to what the U.S. was doing. It hints at that three-actor dynamic again.
Absolutely. India's own strategists, people like K. Subramaniam, apparently believed a limited war was, and I quote, thinkable, since the U.S. presence in Pakistan ensured that it would promptly intervene. So India strategically deferred to U.S. calls for restraint. There's that famous instance where Deputy Secretary Armitage told them, Musharraf will make an important statement and you will be very pleased, just wait. It really was a significant aha moment, wasn't it? Showing India's calculated reliance on U.S. intervention to manage the escalation ladder.
And Pakistan's strategy in this period was also quite distinct. They were a frontline U.S. ally in Afghanistan at that exact moment, giving them unique leverage. How did that play out?
Oh, that leverage was a huge factor. Pakistan very deliberately used its role helping U.S. operations in Afghanistan as a trump card. They hinted that any Indian provocation would affect its ability to assist the U.S. over there. They even moved troops eastward, away from the Afghan border, as a kind of subtle warning shot. They also articulated nuclear red lines, making specific threats about using nuclear weapons if India crossed certain thresholds, like attacking a large part of its territory, destroying its forces, economically strangling it, or causing internal destabilization. Yet at the same time, President Musharraf also issued signals of prudence, calling nuclear use unthinkable. He eventually did accede to U.S. pressure, banning some militant outfits and acknowledging links to cross-border terrorism.
And the U.S. in the middle of all this, mediating between two nuclear-armed states, one of which was a critical ally in an active war zone. That must have been an incredibly delicate balancing act.
It truly was. The U.S. played a A masterfully delicate game, you could say. Secretary Powell's mission right after the Parliament attack involved 3 days of sustained high-pressure diplomacy. He successfully calmed a much milder India and reassured Pakistan. Later, Deputy Secretary Armitage got that commitment from Musharraf to end permanently cross-border, cross-Lasi infiltration. But significantly, he tactically omitted any specific U.S. pledge on the Kashmir issue to the Indian side. He focused solely on immediate de-escalation. This really highlights the U.S. prioritizing ending the crisis right then and there, sometimes even, perhaps, at the cost of the long-term implementability of its assurances. The U.S. also used tools like travel advisories, knowing the economic impact could help spur de-escalation from both sides.
Okay, finally, let's look at the Mumbai crisis of 2008. A horrific terror attack by Pakistani nationals. Did India's restraint puzzle anyone, given the sheer scale of that provocation?
It was indeed a spectacular provocation, one of the most severe in recent memory. But India showed really unprecedented military restraint. They explicitly ruled out extensive mobilization. Their external affairs minister at the time publicly stated, and this is a direct quote, "Nobody is talking about military action." India opted to collate all the information first, giving space for diplomacy to work rather than immediately retaliating. This was a huge strategic choice, especially under the nuclear shadow.
And Pakistan's response, do they acknowledge any responsibility this time?
Well, Pakistan denied state involvement but did express sympathy. They took action against some militants, but they also continued some aggressive rhetoric. Crucially, they again leveraged their importance in Afghanistan, threatening to divert troops if India escalated. The head of Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI, even acknowledged that maybe former ISI personnel had engaged in some broad training of the attackers while strongly rejecting any institutional role. They sort of stalled on the legal investigation but made enough conciliatory gestures to ease international pressure.
How did the U.S. intervene here? Did their approach change, given the clear links to Pakistani territory?
The U.S. intervention was swift, very decisive. The goal was to get out in front of events. Secretary Rice visited almost immediately. While someone like Senator John McCain declared the U.S. was 1,000% behind India, he also explicitly opposed an Afghanistan-style military response by India. The U.S. mediated information, offered FBI assistance partly to slow down the decision-making process in Delhi, give them breathing room, and they put immense pressure on Pakistan, even warning them that the U.S. would be unable to prevent Indian use of force if Pakistan failed to act decisively against the perpetrators. However, the U.S. carefully avoided what the source calls a harsher approach. They were concerned about Pakistan's internal fragility and the risk of state collapse, which could have created even graver consequences.
So looking across these three crises, Kargil, Twin Peaks, Mumbai, what are the big takeaways about brokered bargaining in South Asia? What should our listeners really internalize here?
Yeah, what really stands out is that neither India nor Pakistan ever fully trusted the U.S. as a completely impartial mediator, yet both eagerly engaged the U.S. It just goes to show the inescapable power of that third party. And interestingly, both India's rising economic stature and Pakistan's increasing economic and internal security weakness actually made them more sensitive to third-party preferences, not less. Also, India faced this compellence dilemma, where Pakistan's weakness, ironically, prevents India from taking decisive military action because they fear causing its implosion. That kind of collapse would create a host of new, maybe even more dangerous problems. And this dilemma often necessitates third-party intervention just to manage the situation. Ultimately, the consistent presence of the third party's leverage and its really delicate balancing act helped limit escalation and arguably prevented a full-blown nuclear war in the region.
That's a profound observation about the unintended consequences of weakness. Fascinating. So if brokered bargaining is so crucial in South Asia, how can we apply this framework to other potential nuclear hotspots? What does this tell us about different types of regional rivalries around the world?
Right. That's the critical question, isn't it? About generalizability. Let's explore a few prototypes, a few different scenarios beyond South Asia. First, maybe consider a crisis between two U.S. friends, maybe like Turkey and Egypt hypothetically. Even if both are allies, the U.S. would likely still intervene because of broader global interests. They'd use their reward-punishment leverage to push for de-escalation. Both allies, valuing their relationship with the U.S., would probably be quite sensitive to its preferences. So intervention might be relatively straightforward in terms of leverage.
Okay, that makes sense. What about a trickier one?
Okay, next. Imagine a U.S. friend versus a U.S. foe. The classic example might be Israel and a potentially nuclear-armed Iran. This presents a really acute dilemma for the U.S. Israel would expect full U.S. support, naturally, but Washington's inclination to back its ally would be seriously complicated by the nuclear context. A perception of a U.S.-Israel gang up could force Iran into a dangerous use 'em or lose 'em mindset, feeling they have no other option. So the U.S. would have to balance supporting Israel with avoiding a nuclear catastrophe. They might even need to accept Iran's plausible deniability on certain actions just to prevent things from spiraling out of control.
That sounds incredibly difficult. What about multiple allies against a foe?
Third, let's look at U.S. allies versus a U.S. foe. Think, for example, the U.S., South Korea, and Japan against North Korea. This is absolutely fraught with risk. North Korea has what's sometimes called a moral hazard problem, where being protected from the full consequences of their actions might actually encourage riskier behavior. This often drives its provocations. In this scenario, China, with its unique leverage over Pyongyang, becomes really the only realistic mediator. And the multiple audience problem, trying to send a message that resonates clearly with several different actors simultaneously who might interpret it differently, is highly accentuated here. This is mainly due to minimal direct U.S.-North Korea communication, which significantly increases the risk of misinterpretations and potentially precipitous action.
Okay, one more prototype.
Finally, consider a U.S. friend versus a great power rival, like maybe China and India. This actually presents a somewhat lower risk scenario for nuclear escalation compared to some others, but the stakes are still incredibly high. Both are huge economies. A purely conventional conflict between them would cause massive global economic shocks. Now, U.S. leverage over China might be somewhat blunted due to China's own stature as a great power, but misperceptions about the limits of U.S. leverage could still be destabilizing. In this scenario, neither side would likely gain much by provoking a crisis just to get third-party attention because the economic cost would probably be too great for everyone involved.
So pulling this all together, what does this mean for you, the well-informed learner listening right now, and for policymakers around the world, especially in understanding these complex global dynamics?
Well, the main theoretical takeaway is that brokered bargaining really demands, we think, in terms of a three-actor bargaining framework. It departs significantly from those traditional two-actor models we often rely on, because it involves this constant back and forth, as a recursive interplay, as the source puts it, of how each party perceives the other's intentions, what they expect, what incentives the third party offers or threatens, and the choices they all make. It just can't be simplified into a purely binary interaction.
And in terms of practical policy, what's the most critical takeaway for policymakers actually trying to navigate these high-stakes nuclear environments?
I think policymakers really have to accept the virtual inevitability of third-party involvement in most regional nuclear crises, and they need to avoid artificially forcing bilateral crisis management roles onto the rivals. Trying to push rivals to just sort things out between themselves, for example, could actually backfire badly. It might lead to even greater provocativeness from one side, or maybe a dangerous self-help mindset on the other. Both of those increase escalation risks. Instead, keeping even internationally isolated nuclear states engaged, keeping those lines open, is crucial to retain influence and maintain channels for de-escalation.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. So many aha moments about how these incredibly dangerous situations are actually managed behind the scenes. Given all the complexities we've discussed, the layers of signaling, the role of external pressure, the inherent distrust, what's the most challenging aspect of truly achieving clarity in these nuclear environments? Is perfect clarity even possible?
That really is the central paradox, isn't it? There is absolutely a clear need for robust three-way communication channels during crises. There's a need for rivals like India and Pakistan to develop a shared lexicon, a common understanding of signaling, and the third party needs to be part of that understanding. However, and this is the question maybe for you to mull over with all these layers of signaling involved, with the acknowledged need for third parties sometimes to exaggerate or misrepresent risks, to force de-escalation, and with the inherent distrust among the rivals. Can we truly achieve the absolute clarity needed to prevent misinterpretations? Or is some level of ambiguity an inescapable, perhaps even a necessary part of brokering peace in these incredibly dangerous nuclear environments? It's a very delicate balance to strike.
A really powerful thought to leave us with. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into brokered bargaining. And thank you all for listening. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep learning.